Hello and welcome to the Social Thread podcast. My name is Robert Payne, and with me always is Mr.
Rob Reinders in
Awesome
the
and
house,
in the house. And at Social Thread, we are a
literally.
nonprofit, and we seek to create community where you can belong, you can thrive, and you can explore your faith on your own terms. And with this podcast, we are bringing on guests who we feel are going to help you on your journey. And with us today is the author of the book Love Matters More, Mr. Jared Byas.
Hey
Welcome,
up, guys.
sir.
Hey.
Yeah, welcome, buddy. Good to have you. Jared, can you just take a minute and let us know, or let the folks out there know who you are?
Yeah. Well, I can give you a little bit of background. So I would have grown up in a small town in Texas and grown up in a Southern Baptist and non-denominational charismatic. I'm just going to keep throwing out kind of Christian subculture buzzwords.
Yeah, do it. We got time.
And grew up pretty, I would say in a more fundamentalist evangelical community. And then from a young age wanted to go be a PhD in apologetics. I had wanted to do that since I was a young kid, as I'm sure most young boys my age were wanting to do. And so I stopped off at Liberty, got a degree in philosophy, and then went to Westminster Seminary outside of Philadelphia. And that's when things for me started to take a bit of a turn. The short story is the department. This is not like really sophisticated or intellectual, but the department that housed the apologetics, which is defending Christianity and making sure everyone knows we're right, department were they were just jerks. And I kind of woke up one day and said, I don't really want to follow in these footsteps. And then the biblical studies department sort of embraced me with open arms. And so I switched over to studying the Bible. And turns out when we take the Bible seriously, though not literally, it kind of opens up a world of other things. And so just been on that journey ever since.
Nice. You know what? You even wrote a book about that called Love Matters More.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're really excited for it. We've read it, and I've known you for a while, and what I love reading about it, it's like, and we haven't seen each other in years. We live on different coasts, and but when I read it, I read it as if it's just like we're having a conversation, which has been kind of cool. So I keep it next to my bed at night, and I'm like, "Oh, Jared's there." But no,
that's great and creepy.
Yeah,
but yeah,
a little bit. But that's what I appreciate about your writing style, and that conversational style. So what's the book about? Who's it for?
Well, it's really, to be honest, I hope it's for people who have been raised in a tradition that privileged the intellect, that sort of the more you know about God and theology and faith, the better a Christian you are. And so this is an attempt to validate maybe a lot of people who had a counter narrative that said, I thought it was about showing up for people, being present with people, being in solidarity. And the conversation I thought was really about love and not about getting all of our facts about who God is right. And so this is just my journey in that, of kind of deprivileging the facts, which is an area I was really good at. I was always smart. I always got to, win the sword drills and looked up the Bible verses faster than anyone. And that led me to being a pastor, and that led me to teaching in a university. And that all felt really great. But then to see the Bible's message and the Christian faith message being about love, I felt there was this continual disconnect. And so the more I explored it, the more I realized I maybe had been going down the wrong track.
You talk about this concept of truth in love in the book, and that's something I think in a lot of Christian traditions, people use as like a weapon or like a hammer of like, hey, I love you, but in order to love you, I got to say something really awful to you, or judgmental. And that's a really fascinating discussion you have in the book. Can you talk about more about what that means, and what that looks like from your perspective?
Yeah, there's sort of one anchor to the book. I think it was that verse, telling the truth in love, because I think in my experience, that's been more used as a weapon than something helpful. And so yeah, it's an exploration of what does it mean, and there's a few different ways we can look at that. One is if we look at the biblical context itself, it's really interesting because the whole, if you read like the NIV version, there's headers, and the whole header of that section is about unity. And it's in the context of being humble, being patient, bearing with each other's burdens, like being in solidarity with one another, and maintaining this idea of unity beyond just our disagreements. So it's really interesting that it's been used to do the exact opposite, which is to exclude people, to so kind of disunity, to create in groups and out groups. And it has been the emphasis always falling on the truth. Like, yeah, let's speaking the truth, I mean, in love, if we can, but it's really, let's speak the truth. And let's just be nice about it when we do, even though maybe what we're saying is in itself judgmental and hurtful. As long as we say it with a smile on our face, somehow that makes it all okay. And so I wanted to just explore maybe where we've gotten that wrong and how and why. And so I think that is important. And the conclusion I came to is that within the text and within the Christian tradition, the emphasis needs to fall on the in love part. So whatever we mean by truth, if we don't do it, if we're not in love with the person that we're talking to, it's not true. And I know that sounds weird, but we also have to realize how murky the word truth is in our conversations. We use it to say things like being true to yourself. Okay, what do we mean by that? How is that the same or different than it's true that, masks work pretty well in defending against coronavirus? Like, there's these scientific contexts, and then there's these personal or emotional. And how do we kind of figure out what we're talking about in this world where I feel like news and fake news and truth and all of that gets pretty murky?
You wrote that in Christian culture, we have an addiction to the truth, and I certainly have a lot of personal experience with that. But what do you mean by that? Why do you think we tend to idolize the truth?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, well, first, not to get kind of nerdy, but I think if we go back to the fact that we're in this modern era, so the last 500 years we would call kind of the modern era. And that's been this move out of where authority came from. Basically, you were given it by God to rule over someone, either in the church or in the state. So those were kind of the two powerhouses of where control came from. And then we had things like the Reformation and the Renaissance. And through time, we ended up with democracies and overthrowing monarchies. And so we ended up with a different system. And through that, what we call modernity, we've privileged ideas over all else. I mean, sometimes for good reason. I mean, they've given us some amazing things, better ways of governing, scientific breakthroughs, technology, all of these wonderful things keeping us alive 30 and 40 years longer than we were. But the downside to that is we've created this idol and this cultural privileging of ideas beyond what we even recognize. I don't even think we know that we do this. And the church, for some reason, has gotten on this bandwagon, maybe more than other institutions. And so I think that's the idea of the addiction to truth. Is there isn't maybe anecdotally from my perspective, growing up, if I would have said something like, hey, I'm trying to think of something that would be really bad back then. Even something like, hey, I stole this thing from the store. That would have been met with like, okay, like that's kind of bad. You should ask for forgiveness, that sort of thing. But if I said, I think I believe in evolution, like that was this humongous thing. And so somehow the idea was more important than sort of our behavior or how we behave in the world. And so that's an example of where this addiction to truth is somehow we think the most important thing is that we get it right. As though like forgiveness and all these things depend upon getting it right. Like somehow God can't forgive you of all the bad things you've done unless you pass the theological SATs, which is just sounds strange to me at this point.
Yeah, I remember back when I was the United Methodist campus minister at Arizona State, which is around the time you and I met, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I walked to my office, on campus. To my house was just off campus, so every day I was walking through campus and on campus for various meetings and stuff. And I don't know, it seemed like every other week somebody would stop me to ask me, "Excuse me, sir, what is the truth?" And then there'd be this symposiums, like, sort of, if you read the fine print, you could see it was put on by like a ministry, but it would be like a flyer that it was like a lecture of, like, we are going to figure out the truth at this lecture. And then there were bookstores around campus called like the Veritas bookstore, like the Truth bookstore. And
Mm-hmm.
then there was also this thing that this guy really wanted me to do called the Truth Project. I mean, it's like, I don't know if that still goes on college campuses or whatever, but it seems especially around secular academia, like there's a lot of push from certain traditions to, like, oh no, like they're telling you this is the truth, but we have the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so how do you like figure out like, but I'm like, no, I have, like, I think there's some religious and spiritual truths, but there's also, like, the earth is round. And
Mm-hmm.
it's okay for the college to tell me that. Like, what do you think is going on there? What's that all about?
Well, I think, and in the book, I distinguish between two. I really distinguish between three, but I think the first two is more of what you're talking about, which is what we might call fact truths. And that's the way I talk about it is what would be true in the world if everyone were dead. It's sort of my morbid way of thinking about this. You take humanity out of it, what would be true, accurate about reality, and then you have meaning truths. And so the question is, where does the Christian faith fall? And I would say sometimes in both, and that's what makes it confusing. Was there a person named Jesus who lived? Like, that's a fact truth in the sense that we can go try to find that out in the same way we do other historical facts. What does it mean to love your neighbor? That's kind of a meaning truth, and meaning truths change throughout time and culture because people change, and so it's important when we say things like my truth and your truth, and truth changes and all of these things. Some people want to say, oh, are you saying that all truth is relative? Well, what about if I go stand in front of a truck and get hit? Like, is that relative? Like, no, that's a fact truth, but we use the same word to mean two different things, and so it can be really confusing. And in the book, I argue that there's a third category called wisdom that I think we've really missed out on, which is embodied truth. It's taking the fact truths, it's taking the meaning truths of our time and our culture and our communities, and then it's actually living it out. So that embodiment, that existence, and that's something I think that we miss when we privilege just checking off boxes about abstract things like, did Jonah really get swallowed by a giant fish or not? We miss the meaning of that parable, and we miss the existential call, the invitation to live out maybe this extreme call to love our neighbors. If we spend our time and attention trying to answer the question, did he get swallowed by a big fish? I think it just takes our eye off the ball a little bit. So I think it's important that we just know what we're talking about when we talk about truth, because it's a huge, slippery term.
I love how in your book you have a quick metaphor about, fact truth is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom truth is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad.
Yeah.
And so that kind of leads me to my next question, and kind of what you're talking about, Jonah, here is that if someone asked you, is the Bible true, how would you respond?
I would say, first of all, I would try to set up those categories and say, are you asking me, is it historically accurate in all that it recounts? If that's what you're talking about, we're going to have a different conversation than, does it speak meaningful truths into our lives? And that's a different conversation than what I would want to ultimately get to, which is, I think that's a bad question. And the real question is, I think the Bible resists that question and asks, are we living truly? It turns it into an adverb, and then it can be a tool on that journey. And so I would want to get clear between those three on what we're talking about. Now, if we're talking about historical accuracy, I would say sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But I also think that's, a big word here, anachronism. I think that's putting categories of thought onto the Bible that itself would not have acknowledged or recognized. It's like asking, does the Bible believe in iPhones? Like, I don't know what you mean by that. It's not a category that would have existed back then. So we can speculate on like what Jesus would think about social media, but I don't know. And it's the same here when we're talking about historical accuracy. We have to understand that ancient people thought of those things differently than we did. And then meaning truths, again, I think there's a lot to be said for how we make meaning and discover meaning and create meaning from the biblical text. But then again, I think those are both good and important. Again, this is called Love Matters More, not love is the only thing that matters. Those are good and important things, but they're all stepping stones in my mind to this life well lived, which for me, I think in the Christian tradition is a life characterized by love.
A lot has gone on in the world the last few months. I don't know if you've noticed.
What?
Yeah, I know, crazy. And I'm assuming that the book was finished well before COVID, and I don't want to say it was finished before periods of racial injustice and
right, the most recent visible, yeah,
right, yeah, exactly. And maybe it's the combination of the two where it just makes the world seem like it's on fire, and you are in some parts of the world it is on fire,
right.
But how would you change anything? Do you see what you've written different? Do you think folks are going to take something different away now that the world is I think drastically different just over the last few months?
Yeah, I mean, my examples would definitely have changed for sure.
Yeah.
But I think there's also something to, maybe this is just a time to process this. I'm not the expert in this. I think one of the challenges I had in writing the book is how do we acknowledge that our approach, how do we love people well and disagree with them while not advocating for marginalized groups and people who haven't been invited to the table to just have this doormat theology or doormat ethic, which is like love is just continuing to not have a voice. And so I think there is a conversation there that goes beyond the scope of the book, but I think it's the next step of conversation here of how do we continue to fight for justice, and yet how do we fight in a way that is loving? How do we not become, right, as Nietzsche says, how do we not stare into the abyss for so long that it stares back at us? How do we not become the thing that we are trying to fight against? I think that would be a different conversation now.
Yeah. One thing I just thought of when you mentioned, the conversations we have in our public discourse, which devolves by the minute. I'm thinking of cancel culture. How does love matter? How does love matter more in cancel culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's an individual discussion of why we're doing the things that we're doing. Because again, I don't want to invalidate the people who need to have boundaries around certain conversations. I think that's different than you're canceled as a punishment for the things that you've said online. I think I think I want to make that distinction because there are people who need to say, hey, mom, dad, sister, brother, friends online, like I can't keep having this conversation because it's hurtful and it's not good for my mental health. And if you can't do this in a respectful way, I can't have that conversation. I think that's a really appropriate way of setting up boundaries. I think cancel culture is very different and it's used as a way to punish. And I think the only thing I would say, and I don't know how this ties with Love Matters More, but I do think it doesn't give room for a lot of grace and doesn't incentivize people to grow and learn. And for me, this Love Matters More is kind of the point of that. It's that we can stay in this container and continue to learn and grow from one another. And it's okay that you're not where I was. And I would say I'm so glad that people who would be on further along in the spiritual journey, I would say, than me, didn't cancel me back when I was kind of a jerk about all of this, because I wouldn't be where I am now. So I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot by cutting off the conversation rather than learning how to have this compassionate, graceful, yet confident and boundaried sense of the conversation.
Yeah. What are some practical way? I know we're all supposed to stay separate from each other, or whatever. What are some some practical ways we can put all this into practice.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few things that I think I cover some of these in the book, but I think one thing that's really important for me is reframing what I want out of conversations. So if I go into it thinking that the goal here is to convince you, then I'm going to approach that conversation very differently. If my conversation is, recently I had a conversation with my mom about Black Lives Matter. We are on different ends of the spectrum in that conversation. And but I went into that conversation saying, you know what? This is an opportunity to hear from my mom about what she thinks and why she thinks it, what she believes. And at the end of the day, I'm going to love my mom. And I know we have this bedrock of other experiences and relationship outside of this one conversation. And so we could have it because my goal wasn't to convince my mom. It was to maybe try to find some common ground, some discussion, maybe have a few questions that might cause her to think. And that leads to the second thing too, is I think learning to be okay with these not resolving. Because I think we feel like dissatisfied at the end of the conversation if like I haven't convinced you or you haven't convinced me. But the reality is that almost never happens. So we should maybe lay that down as an appropriate goal for these and have a different goal, which may be just connection or listening, curiosity. So for me, if I come out of it feeling like they truly understand more of where I am and why I'm in that place, and if I can understand where they are and why they're in that place, I consider that a successful conversation. So I think those are key things. And I think the third one would be to understand that we're not responsible, nor are we empowered to change other people. So when I can take responsibility for myself and I always talk about keeping my side of the street clean. At the end of the conversation, did I conduct myself in a way that I'm proud of, or did I not? And I can't really worry about whether someone else attacked me and use blame language, but simply keep the responsibility on my side and say, did I represent the kind of person and human I want to be, even in the face of that kind of thing?
Hey, so Jared, you took all of this time to write this book, Love Matters More. And so what do you hope readers will take away from the book?
I mean, I think my goal would be that people take away the idea that love matters more, in the sense that in our conversations, in our dialogue, especially around the election, around our different political stances, around our different, all the things we've talked about, racial tensions, these things, that at the end of the day, love matters more. And I think if we truly put that at the top of our goals, I think it would change how we have these conversations. What does it mean to love my enemy? I mean, that's one of Jesus's kind of hallmark of what makes the Christian faith distinct, not distinct at this point, but I think an important addition to the religious dialogue is the idea that we need to love our enemies. And we have a lot of enemies right now. And it's not saying turn our enemies into friends. It's saying they may still be your enemies, but how do we love them in the face of that? I think that's the challenge. So I hope that, just in the sense that I think people are going into this trying to convince people to vote for Biden or Trump or whatever the thing I'm trying to convince you of, it's that how we do that is just as important as what we're doing. And that how we do it can be a louder and more powerful message than the words coming out of our mouth. So I hope that's what people take out of it, is an awareness of how we're showing up, and the way that we're having these conversations is just as important. And that's to go back to the very beginning. That's what it means for me to tell the truth in love, is that the in love part is just as important, if not more important, than the telling the truth part.
Nice. Hey, just real quick, where can folks, I'm assuming folks pick up the book at their favorite bookseller, wherever that is, but where can folks get more of your work and out there in the world?
Yeah, related to the book, you can go to lovemattersmorebook.com, but I love also having conversations. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And of course, our ongoing work is at thebiblefornormalpeople.com. We have a community there on Patreon, patreon.com/thebiblefornormalpeople, where we have a huge group of people, relatively speaking. We have a lot of people who are talking about the Bible, talking about faith, and kind of to go back, the reason I mentioned that is our whole purpose for our Patreon community is to be a community. because there are a lot of people who feel very alone in these questions. They feel like if they were to share their doubts or questions, they're going to get kicked out of their communities. So this is a place to kind of explore that in a safe way.
Well, that's awesome. Jared, thank you so much for your book and for your work. It's super meaningful. And thank you so much for being here, a part of this podcast with us today.
Absolutely. Keep up the good work.
Awesome. Well, hey, if you have found this conversation meaningful to you and you want to get involved, you can go to www.socialthread.org and click Get Involved, and you can join community where you can explore your faith on your own terms there. If you found this conversation meaningful but want to get involved in a way of monetary support, you can, of course, also go to socialthread.org/support, where you can make a tax-deductible donation. But yes, thank you so much for being here. Great conversation, y'all, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, guys, and take care, everybody.